Hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be with you all today, albeit virtually, and I hope you're having a really good time at the workshop so far. I just want to start by taking the opportunity to thank Alva for organising this workshop and for inviting me to be part of it. I really hope that my talk is useful and that it complements the other talks and that you go on to have lots of really fruitful and interesting discussions around co-production today. So I presume that I would have been introduced already, but just to recap that I am Laura and I work at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, or Cray, which is based at UCL in London. And I've been told that you should have already had an introduction to what co-production is. So I'm not going to reiterate that here, but I did just want to start by sharing this quote, which I think really sums up what co-production means for me. And that's the fact that co-production, or participatory experience, as it's described here, is not simply a method or a set of methodologies, but instead it's a mindset and an attitude about people. It's the belief that all people have something to offer. And that's the belief and a value that I hold dear throughout all of my research. And I hope that comes across in my talk today as well. So in terms of what I'm going to speak about, what I thought I'd do was focus on my journey through co-production, focusing specifically on some of the challenges that I faced along the way, as well as challenges that other researchers have reported within their own research. And I also wanted to put an emphasis on how I think we can try to overcome these challenges in line with the topic of today's workshop. So let's start with my journey. Well, when I started in research, co-production was not something that I was doing, nor was it something that I even knew about. So when I was studying at university and was learning about research, co-production just wasn't mentioned. And instead, very traditional methods of research were emphasised, whereby you as the researcher were the expert. So you developed an in-depth knowledge of the theory and the research in the field. You decided what to focus your research on. You decided how that research was being conducted. You would carry that research out on your participants. You'd make sense of your data. You'd write up the findings, and then you might send a short summary of the findings to your participants. But that would be the extent of their involvement in the research. So all the power in that interaction was with you as the researcher. And for me, I plodded along like this, doing my research on memory in autistic people, because that was the kind of thing that everyone was working on at the time. You know, this was a good 15 years ago now. And most of the UK-based autism research then was focusing on cognition in autistic people. So things like memory and attention and so on. And to be honest, I just jumped on the bandwagon. You know, I didn't think to challenge the status quo. But what I did do was really enjoy talking to my participants and learning from them. So my PhD was on autobiographical memory in autistic people. So memory for personally experienced events and information. And while it was quantitative in nature, it did involve data collection methods that gave participants the opportunity to narrate their memories and their experiences. And I just loved it so much. I mean, it was genuinely such a privilege to get to meet lots of really interesting people and learn more about their lives. And the only downside really was that the interactions could be quite upsetting at times, really, because it just cemented to me how poorly society treats autistic people. But at least I think one of the benefits here was I really got to learn more about what mattered to the autistic community. And when I was doing my research and was asking my participants about their memory, one of the things that came through really strongly was about the process of accessing an autism diagnosis and navigating what that meant for them. And it was listening to these accounts that led me to pursue a project on experiences of autism diagnosis in the UK. So at the time, it wasn't a conscious thing that I did in terms of having community members drive the direction of my research, like you do in co-production. But kind of inadvertently, that was certainly what happened. And that leads me on to the next part of my journey, which was doing this autism diagnosis project. And it was a project that I was really proud of, in that it was a quantitative and qualitative project identifying what was working well and what could be improved in relation to autism diagnosis. And I thought it had really important implications. For example, it really highlighted how poor the provision of post-diagnostic support was for this group. So I wanted to try and share my findings as much as possible. And at this time, so this was about 10 years ago now, there was a really, really big focus in the field on ensuring that research had impact and getting findings beyond academic audiences. So when I completed my research and I had my findings, I decided to organise an event and invite lots of stakeholders along and tell them all about my research. And I very excitedly did this, and I spent lots of time and effort and energy setting up my event. But then I hit a barrier. More specifically, I received an email from a rather irate autistic person who wasn't happy with my event. So essentially what happened was that my event was called Autism Diagnosis, Making Voices Heard. And this person felt that it wasn't right to have an event about autism and to call it Making Voices Heard and only have one autistic person speaking. So I got the email, and if I'm being honest, I kind of slightly panicked somewhat. It just wasn't the response that I was anticipating, rather big-headedly. I thought that everyone was going to be delighted that I'd arranged this brilliant event to showcase this amazing research. And I just didn't know how to respond. But what I did do was to reflect a lot on what they said. And I came to the conclusion that, in all fairness, they were right. So I emailed them back and I apologised, and I kind of tried to explain why there was just one autistic person. And essentially it was because the event and my research involved eliciting the parent voice, the professional voice, and the autistic voice. And I wanted to try and get one speaker from each of those. But I completely get that the autistic voice really needs to be centred in circumstances like this. And I didn't do that. And in all fairness, it wasn't that common to do so back then anyway. But I was in the wrong, and I felt that I really needed to own that. And I contacted them and I said that I really hoped that they'd come to the event. And I was really, really pleased that they did. And we met at this event in person. And one of the things that they said to me, which has kind of always stuck with me, was how much they appreciated the fact that I responded to them, because they mentioned that they sent lots of emails like that and rarely ever got a reply. And they were also very kind in saying that they were really pleased that I did have an autistic speaker present, and that was actually doing more than many other events were doing at the time. So it was very, very, a very nice conversation, and we kind of got chatting some more. And it turned out that we had loads in common. So my research, for example, was identifying that there was a lack of post-diagnostic support for autistic adults. And this person had developed a psychoeducation and peer support program for autistic adults. So very closely aligned. And anyway, we stayed in touch, and in due course, they asked if I'd be open to doing some research with them about this program that they developed. And this was one of my first experiences of a kind of proper co-produced study whereby it was real power sharing. So I was bringing my research expertise and they were bringing their lived and professional expertise, and we worked together to design a study. We worked out how to collect the data, how to analyze the data, and how to interpret and how to share the findings. And the result was this paper, which I'm super proud of, which was evaluating the brilliant Exploring Being Autistic program that was developed by Caroline Hurst, who I'm really proud to call a very dear colleague and friend of mine. And one of the things I will emphasize is that there were lots of barriers in this project. For example, there was no funding to do this research, and we also had to kind of manage conflicts of interest very carefully because Caroline developed this program, so could have been perceived as having a kind of vested interest in a favourable evaluation of this program. But there were also lots of opportunities as well, and particularly I learned so much from the process about how to do really, really high quality ethical research with the autistic community. So, for example, Caroline put lots of things in place to make sure that participants felt comfortable. So, for example, I turned up with their permission at one of the sessions towards the end of the programme, and I got to meet everyone and tell them a bit about me, and they got to ask me questions about kind of my motivations for doing the research and, you know, what I was going to be doing with the information that they told me and so on. And we kind of got to hang out and have pizza and really just got to reduce that power differential between me as the researcher and them as the kind of researched. And it was this experience, among others, as part of this project that really shaped the way that I did my research going forward. And shortly after I began working on that project, I moved to Cray, the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, which was then led by the brilliant Liz Pellicano, who's a real champion and pioneer of co-production in autism research. And it was here that I got to work on lots of other really brilliant co-produced projects where power was really genuinely shared between researchers and community members, and where autistic people and family members and researchers and people who worked with them had a really genuine say in the research that was being carried out and the way that research was being carried out. And, you know, at every stage there was input. And the other thing I really like about working at Cray is I think one of the reasons that we get to do a lot of co-produced research is because we really try to get research accessible outside of academia. So we do things like having public events that are open to everyone, and film screenings of autism relevant films, and Christmas card competitions for local schools. Really anything that means that our centre, which is based within a kind of traditional academic institution, can become more accessible to everyone and anyone who's got an interest in autism and education. So we work really hard to break down those barriers. And I'm a real convert to this way of working, but it quickly became apparent to me that this wasn't a typical way of working, and not everyone was working in this way, but I wasn't quite sure why. And this kind of curiosity led to a piece of research that I did with some colleagues in the UK and Australia, looking at what early career researchers and also more established researchers thought about participatory and co-produced research, focusing on the opportunities as well as the challenges. And we did interviews and focus groups with our participants, and we identified 3 key themes that I'll talk to you about now. So first of all, our interviewees highlighted the flexible nature of participatory research and the many forms that this could take. But they also noticed that this could be confusing. And in particular, they couldn't quite work out what kind of proper co-produced research looked like. And they spoke about how hard it was to know because the words used in co-production aren't really very black and white. So people often talk about kind of meaningful or genuine co-production, but what does that mean? And our participants kind of wanted something like a manual or a checklist to kind of better understand whether their research kind of ticked the boxes in that regard. And I must say that I think that this suggestion actually is a product of the fact that most of our interviewees were psychologists. And I think psychologists quite like things to be quite clear and compartmentalized and objective and procedural and so on. But essentially, I think co-production and co-produced research means giving up a little bit of that control. And I think that many of our participants kind of struggled with that a little bit. And I think in terms of overcoming this challenge, the thing that's been really helpful for me is just accepting that you have to relinquish control, but also remembering that actually there's no one right way to do co-produced research. There's lots of different very valid ways to co-produce, and how you go about co-producing will differ based on each individual project that you do. And for me, I find that the best way to kind of get ideas about how to co-produce research and the different methods that I might use really comes from just engaging with lots of different examples of co-produced research and then using it as a kind of bricolage where you can pick and choose different bits for each individual research study that you do. So reading really good examples of co-produced research really is, I think for me, some of the best training that I can get. The second theme that we identified in our research was that researchers felt that it was really important to build relationships with community members, but they also noted that this could be hard. And this was partly linked to challenges in communication between people of different neurotypes, but also because our participants felt that there was a kind of core group of autistic people who tended to often contribute to research quite a lot. And we had a lot of discussion about this as a research team, because we felt that when we pick research collaborators, for example, we don't look for diversity, we look for experts. And we weren't really quite clear why these same criteria weren't being applied to community collaborators. And I think here there's a kind of common misconception that we treat our community collaborators like we treat our participants. And actually, it's a whole different ballgame and different rules apply here. But it was certainly something that our participants in this study were really quite worried about. The third theme that came through from our findings, I think, is a really important one. And this is the feeling that participatory or co-produced research is quite undervalued in academia. So our participants noted that co-produced research takes time, it takes effort, and there isn't much funding available. And also, particularly our early career researchers were commenting that some of their principal investigators or more senior research staff that they worked with don't really have experience to offer in terms of co-production. So they reported lots and lots of challenges, but they did also emphasize that they felt it led to better research. And it's how we overcome these. And for me, I think two things are needed. So I think we need top-down change. You know, we need better funding structures. We need better processes in place to facilitate co-production and so on. But we also need bottom-up change. And what we need is researchers, particularly those at the early stages of their career, to really push for change and to really innovate. And I think to push the boundaries of what we think is possible in research. And I think that's a really exciting prospect for people at the start of their careers. But I think what people really want to know is, well, where do I start? And I wanted to kind of finish off my talk today by trying to give some really concrete recommendations for change. And here I want to draw on an article that I was interviewed for by Spectrum News, for which the author interviewed a range of people involved in participatory and co-produced research and identified 6 steps for those who want to start engaging in this way of working, which I think are really, really helpful. So I'm going to go through these next. So the first recommendation was to look inward. And this is for researchers to really reflect on why they're doing the work they're doing and how it will benefit people. So for autism researchers, it's, do you understand autistic culture? You know, have you considered your biases? Do you understand the priorities and the preferences of autistic people? And it's this process of reflection and, you know, like I mentioned at the beginning, adopting that right mindset that everyone has something to offer that's so, so important. So that's number one. The second is to meet autistic people. It's getting on Twitter, it's getting into communities, and it's paying attention to what people are saying to you. I think you have to tread carefully, you know, be really respectful of autistic spaces, but equally don't expect people to come to you. It's your kind of imperative as a researcher, you need to go to them. The third thing is to assemble your team. So start small by working with a few people that you have trusting relationships with, and perhaps those that have research experience. But then as you get more experience in this way of working, it's potentially broadening out to build capacity, perhaps to those with little or no research experience, so you can take the role of scaffolding the research that little bit more. Number 4, share the power. So make it clear what people do and don't have decision-making power over, but try to ensure that people have a say as much as possible. And it might be helpful here to try and work out democratic ways of voting on key decisions as well. And I think there's some great examples of this in the literature. Number 5, pay people. Researchers get paid, community members should get paid. Show that you value people's expertise and also be really transparent about payment as well. And number 6 is be nimble. So you may start out with the most fantastic plan, but it may need to change, and that's okay. I think participatory or co-produced research is inherently flexible, and it's really important that we try and embrace that. So lots of really, really helpful tips in that article, and I hope that that encourages people with little or no experience to try and give it a go. And if anyone wants more guidance and support, there's also some really wonderful organisations that can help with co-production. For example, I'm very proud to be a member of Co-Production Collective based at UCL, who champion co-production and welcome everyone into their co-production community. And they have loads of helpful resources and information, and also run co-pro cuppas where like-minded people can come together and chat about all things co-production related, including barriers that they may encounter in their work to try and troubleshoot together. And this is something quite specific to autism, but I was part of a team led by Liz Pellicano, who organised the Shaping Autism Research seminar series in the UK several years ago. And as part of that, we developed a starter pack for people who are new to this way of working, to try and support them in small steps that they can take to make their work more participatory. So really involving the autistic community in a more meaningful way. And this can be downloaded from the Shaping Autism Research website, which is listed at the bottom of the slide. So I think I'm going to finish off there and just say a big thank you to everyone for listening. A thank you again to Alva for organising this excellent event, and I hope everyone has a really wonderful rest of the day.